Last time we looked at the question of were the Gospels originally anonymous, and I showed you that all of the manuscript evidence agrees and gives the authors' names at the top, either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But we didn't actually look at what are the arguments for anonymity. One of the main arguments that people use to say that the Gospels were originally anonymous is that they don't name themselves in the actual text of their works. Other than the title at the very top, their names never come up again. They never say, like, I, Matthew, was walking with Jesus, or something like that. They never name themselves in the Gospels. And so people say that since they don't actually name themselves in the Gospel's text itself, the Gospel must have originally been anonymous and the title must have just been added later. So the question is, if someone doesn't name themselves in their work, does that mean that their work is anonymous? Well, we have lots of historical works written at the same time that the Gospels were written, in which the authors do not name themselves, and yet these works are clearly not anonymous. So the Gospels are usually considered either Greco-Roman biographies or Greco-Roman histories. And let's look at some examples of Greco-Roman biographies and histories in which the authors didn't name themselves in their works. So for example, Xenophon doesn't name himself at the beginning of his text in Hellenica or Anabasis. Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in Greek similar to the Gospels, and right around the same time as the Gospels, doesn't name himself in Antiquities of the Jews. Greek historians Polybius and Diodorus Siculus don't name themselves in their works. Some Roman historians writing in Latin who didn't name themselves were Tacitus and Florus. And so that's some Greco-Roman histories. What about Greco-Roman biographies? Because a lot of people say that the Gospels are the genre of Greco-Roman biographies. So let's look at some biographies. Philo omits his name from his biographically oriented works on Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. Now this is really important because these works are probably the most similar to the genre of the Gospels, and he doesn't name himself in those works. Some more examples would be Plutarch doesn't name himself in Parallel Lives, Lucian doesn't include his name in the preface of Alexander the False Prophet, Philostratus's The Life of Apollonius and Lives of the Sophists do not include his name. And there's a lot more examples, but I don't want this video to be too boring, so I won't go through them all. But my point is, it was actually not uncommon for Greco-Roman historians and biographers to leave their names out of their works, but this did not mean that their works were anonymous. Now you might be wondering, if they left their name out of the work, then how do we know who the author was? Well, for example, there might be a title at the beginning like we have in the Gospels, or if you think that these titles were maybe added later, despite the manuscript evidence, there were 7 other ways that the authors could have named themselves in their works. So we have an example from very early on, late 2nd century or early 3rd century, so coming just over 100 years after the Gospel was written, and this was a flyleaf containing the phrase Euangelion kata Matthaion. So what this shows is that it said a gospel according to Matthew. So just because an author's name is not in the actual text itself, it could have been at the top like we have in all of our manuscripts, or it could have been a flyleaf like this. So the argument that the Gospels must have been anonymous since the authors don't name themselves in the actual text is not unusual for a historical work from that time period. It does not mean the work was anonymous, and there are plenty other ways that an author could have named himself in the work. So never let someone argue that the Gospels were anonymous. People argue this all the time, but there's simply no evidence. If you like this evidence, be sure to subscribe because I'm going to be giving you a lot more evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Thanks.